For 18 years, a man in a small town in central Wisconsin has been mapping Dogman's sightings. Every credible report he could verify going back decades, plotted on a master grid covering 8 states across the Great Lakes region and the upper Midwest. 1,247 entries last he counted, each one with a date, a location, a witness profile, a sighting description, and a confidence rating based on a methodology he developed during a long career as a federal land management cartographer who spent most of his working life mapping wildlife corridors and habitat boundaries. For most of those 18 years, the map looked the way you would expect a map of Dogman sightings to look across that region. Scattered clusters in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, a line of reports running through the Wexford and Lake County corridors, the famous Bray Road cluster in southeastern Wisconsin, activity in southern Pennsylvania and across the Ohio border, a handful of reports from Minnesota's boundary waters, the pattern you would expect from a small breeding population established across the available habitat. Then, starting around 2023, the pattern broke. Sightings in the lower peninsula of Michigan dropped off in clusters that had produced consistent reports for 30 years. Reports from the boundary waters and the upper Mississippi corridor went quiet. The activity in Pennsylvania and Ohio dried up to almost nothing. And the data point density in one specific area, a corridor of national forest and tribal land in the northwest corner of Wisconsin, started to climb. Not gradually, geometrically. By the end of 2025, that single corridor accounted for nearly 40% of all credible sightings across the entire region he had been tracking. Something is happening to the Dogman population in the Great Lakes states. Whatever it is consolidating, it is moving, and it is moving toward the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest and the Penokee Range into a corridor of roughly 600 square miles that the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa fought for over a decade to protect from industrial development. The man who built that database asked me not to use his name. He spent over 3 decades working for a federal land management agency in the upper Midwest, and the work he has been doing on his own time would still be career-ending if it were attached to him publicly even now, 4 years after his retirement. We will call him Bruce. He agreed to talk on the condition that no detail in this story would let people in his community connect his real identity to the database he has been building since 2008. He has reasons for that caution which will become clear as this goes on. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Bruce is in his late 60s. He retired from his agency a few years ago after a career that spanned the better part of 3 decades. His work involved geographic information systems, the technical discipline of overlaying environmental, biological, and human use data onto digital maps to identify patterns, predict animal movements, and inform land management decisions. He spent his career applying that methodology to elk, to wolves, to black bear, to species the federal government recognizes and manages. The skills he developed are the same skills he has been applying for 18 years to a species the federal government does not recognize. He started the Dogman database in 2008 because of an incident he could not stop thinking about. A colleague of his, a wildlife biologist working in a national forest in the eastern Great Lakes region, had been investigating a livestock predation case on a private inholding inside the forest boundary. A small farmer had lost 3 calves over the course of a week, and the depredation pattern did not fit anything in the official rotation of likely predators. The kills were too clean for coyotes, and the carcass placement was too deliberate for black bears. The biologist had photographed the scene, taken plaster casts of the tracks at the kill site, and submitted everything to a wildlife forensics lab. The lab came back with a result the biologist had not anticipated. The tracks could not be matched to any known species in the lab's reference collection. The closest matches were canid in morphology. but exceeded the size parameters of any North American canid by a substantial margin. The lab recommended additional field investigation. The regional office filed the report and recommended no further action. Bruce saw that report because his job at the time involved producing habitat models for predator management, and his colleague forwarded him the file expecting him to find it interesting. He did. He had heard rumors during his career the way every long-tenured federal employee in the upper Midwest had heard rumors. Stories that did not get told in offices but that came out at retirement parties when the alcohol had been flowing long enough. A district ranger in Michigan who had stopped doing field inspections alone after something happened in a remote part of his unit. A wildlife technician in Minnesota who had transferred to a desk job after a single night in the boundary waters that he refused to discuss. A forester in Wisconsin who had retired early and moved to Arizona and would not return calls from his former colleagues. Bruce had heard the stories. He had filed them under the heading of the kind of thing that happens to people who spend too much time alone in the woods. The lab report on the calf kills was different. The lab report was data. He started the database that month. He used the same software he used at work, the same methodology, the same standards of evidence. He decided early on that he was not going to be a collector of internet folklore. He would track reports that came from credible witnesses, that had specific date and location information, that included physical evidence or testimony detailed enough to evaluate. By 2012, he had 300 entries. By 2016, 600. By the time he retired, he was past 1,000. Bruce's wife knew about the database in the way spouses know about retirement projects that take up a corner of the house but do not interfere with daily life. We will call her Nancy. They have been married for over 40 years. She did not ask too many questions because Bruce did not invite them and because for most of those 18 years the work was abstract enough that it did not seem to be affecting him. He went into the office. He came out for meals. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. The database was something he could pick up and put down, a puzzle he was working on. Until the geometry of the puzzle changed. The country Bruce has been tracking covers a region most people drive through without paying attention to it. Once the white pine was cut and the iron mines closed and the small farms failed during the Depression, and the young people moved to Detroit and Milwaukee and Chicago, large tracts of land in northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northeastern Minnesota reverted to forest. The result, by the 20-teens, was a band of nearly contiguous forested country running across the upper Midwest, broken only by the Great Lakes themselves and by the small towns and highways that thread through it. That country is where Bruce's data points live. The white space on the map where the population density drops to single digits per square mile and the road network thins out. For most of the 18 years Bruce has been tracking it, the Dogman population in this region appeared stable. The reports came in at a consistent rate. The geographic distribution shifted slightly with the seasons but stayed within recognized clusters. The behavioral patterns matched what Linda Godfrey had been documenting in her 30 years of work across the Great Lakes states. Nocturnal activity, association with ridgelines and water corridors, territorial behavior, avoidance of dense human settlement. Bruce treated the data the way a wildlife biologist would treat data on any cryptic predator. He built habitat suitability models. He ran corridor analyses. He estimated population density by region. By 2022, his best guess was that the entire Great Lakes population sat somewhere between 60 and 120 individuals distributed across roughly 80,000 square miles of suitable habitat. Those numbers stayed stable for a long time. Then they started changing. The first thing Bruce noticed was the decline in lower Michigan. The Wexford and Lake County clusters had been the most productive sighting areas in his entire dataset for as long as he had been running it. The Pine River Corridor, the Manistee National Forest, the country between Cadillac and Baldwin, where some of the oldest documented Dogman reports in modern American history had originated. The 1887 lumberjack sighting in Wexford County. The 1987 Steve Cook song recordings on WTCM that opened the floodgates of decades of suppressed witness testimony. Decades of consistent reports from a region where the habitat suitability scores were near the maximum his model could produce. In 2023, the report rate from that region dropped by 60%. In 2024, it dropped another 40%. By the spring of 2025, the Wexford Lake Corridor was producing fewer than 3 reports per quarter, down from an average of 12 to 15 for the previous decade. Bruce's first thought was that something had changed in his collection methodology. He went back through his sources. Nothing had changed. The reports just were not coming in. The same pattern emerged in northern Minnesota. The Boundary Waters cluster had never been as active as Michigan, but it had been steady. Through 2023 and 2024, the report rate from the entire region encompassing the Boundary Waters and the Superior National Forest dropped to almost 0. Pennsylvania and Ohio went quiet next. By the summer of 2024, both areas had gone effectively silent. Bruce was now looking at a map where the highest producing regions of his entire data set had dropped off, and his total report volume should have collapsed accordingly. It had not. The report volume across his network was actually higher than it had been in 2022. The reports had just relocated. They had relocated to a single corridor. Bruce ran the centroid analysis the first time in October of 2024. The geographic mean center of all his sightings from the previous 12 months sat at coordinates inside the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin, less than 30 miles from the Lake Superior shoreline. He ran the same analysis for the 12 months prior to that. The centroid had been over 240 miles to the east, in the central lower peninsula of Michigan. Over the span of about 24 months, the geographic mean of his entire active sighting dataset had moved across most of the upper Great Lakes. He spent 3 weeks in November and December of 2024 going back through his data, verifying every report from the previous 2 years, checking his geocoding, running the analyses with different statistical methods. The pattern held. He ran density mapping on the Wisconsin corridor. The reports clustered along a band of country roughly 30 miles wide and 40 miles long, running northwest to southeast from the Bayfield Peninsula, down through the Penokee Hills, and into the headwaters of the Bad River and the White River. The corridor included most of the Bad River Reservation, the eastern half of the Chequamegon National Forest, the Penokee Range, and a stretch of private and state forest land between them. The total area enclosed within the high-density zone came out to just under 600 square miles. If you have driven Highway 2 between Hurley and Ashland or come up Highway 13 along the Lake Superior shore, you have passed through the edges of this corridor without knowing what you were looking at. The country is dense forest and steep terrain, drained by some of the cleanest rivers in the upper Midwest. The Bad River carries snowmelt and rainfall off the Penokee Escarpment down to the great wetland complex along Lake Superior, where the Bad River Band has lived and harvested wild rice for centuries. If you have ever pulled off at one of the wayside parks along that stretch of road and looked south into the timber, let me know in the comments. Because based on the reports Bruce has been collecting from that area over the past 2 years, you were closer to something than you knew. By January of 2025, Bruce had decided he needed to do fieldwork himself. He needed to see the corridor in person. He needed to walk it, talk to people who lived in it, see whether the report cluster was producing physical evidence he could examine and document with his own equipment. He told Nancy he was going to do some research travel. He did not specify what the project was. Nancy did not press him. He packed his truck with the field equipment he had accumulated over the previous decade, the trail cameras and the thermal optics and the casting kit and the GPS units and the recording gear. He drove north on a Monday morning in early February with a cooler of food and a thermos of coffee and the directions to a man we will call Stan, a retired Wisconsin conservation officer who had been one of his best correspondents. Stan had spent 26 years with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources before retiring in the late 20-teens. He had been involved in wolf depredation investigations, bear management, and the general law enforcement duties of a conservation warden in a remote district. Stan was the kind of correspondent Bruce treasured, credible, detail-oriented, with a professional background that gave him both the access to information and the ability to evaluate it. Stan had been feeding Bruce reports from his old district for years, including some he had personally investigated when he was still on the job. Reports that had been filed under standard wildlife encounter codes because the DNR had no other category for them. Stan had been telling Bruce since the spring of 2024 that something was going on in his old district. The reports he was hearing from his former colleagues and from the loggers and hunters who still trusted him were more frequent than they had ever been. He had been waiting for Bruce to come up and look at it. The drive from central Wisconsin to Stan's place outside Mercer took most of a day. Bruce arrived in the early evening, in the kind of cold that the upper Midwest produces in February when the wind comes off Lake Superior with nothing to slow it down. Stan greeted him at the door with a handshake and a cup of coffee, and they spent the first evening looking at maps spread out on the dining room table. Stan had been doing his own informal documentation since 2023. He had been getting calls from people he had not heard from in decades. He had a notebook full of his own entries, tracks found in spring snow along a logging road near Mellon, a vocalization a hunter had recorded on his phone outside Hayward in November of 2024. A trail camera clip from a property owner near Iron Belt that the owner had refused to share publicly but had let Stan view. Hair samples recovered from a barbed wire fence on a hunting lease near Glidden that Stan had collected himself and was keeping in his freezer because he did not know what else to do with them. Stan's information lined up exactly with what Bruce's database was showing. The next morning they drove south on Highway 51 and then west on Highway 77 into the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, following back roads Stan knew from his years on the job. The country they were driving through is hard to describe to anyone who has not spent time in the upper Midwest in winter. Cedar swamps black under the snow. Stands of red pine planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s, standing in their straight rows along the road shoulders. Mature northern hardwood on the higher ground, the bare canopy of maple and beech and birch reaching up gray against the gray sky. They drove until they reached a forest road that the DNR no longer maintained in winter. And Stan stopped the truck at the gated entrance and they got out and put on snowshoes. The first sign Bruce found was in a sandy wash along a small tributary of the Marengo River, about 3/4 of a mile in from the road. The wash had been blown clear of snow by the wind, exposing a strip of soft sand and frozen silt about 10 feet wide. The wash held a clear set of impressions running upstream, made within the past 3 or 4 days based on the freshness of the wind drift over them. The tracks were canid in morphology. The pad shape, the toe arrangement, the claw marks at the front were unambiguous. The size was wrong for any canid native to Wisconsin. The pads measured nearly 6 inches long. The straddle was over 10 inches. The stride length between impressions ran around 50 inches at a steady walk. And the track pattern, the relationship between the front feet and the rear feet, was the same pattern Bruce had been reading about for years in correspondent reports but had never seen with his own eyes. The rear feet did not register on the front feet. They landed separately, bipedal gait. Stan stood next to him while Bruce crouched in the sand and measured. Stan had seen these tracks before. They had been the reason he had started his own informal documentation. What was new for Stan was the frequency. He told Bruce he was finding tracks like these at 4 or 5 locations across his old district now, where 2 years ago he had only known about 1 or 2 reliable spots. The animals that produced these tracks had been a presence in this country for as long as Stan could remember, but they had been rare. Now they were common. Now they were everywhere. They followed the tracks upstream for about a quarter mile until the wash narrowed and the substrate gave out. Bruce cast the 2 clearest impressions with the kit he had brought. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles with a scale, ruler, and frame. He logged the GPS coordinates and the date and time and the weather conditions. He treated these tracks the same way he would have treated tracks from any species his employer recognized. The methodology did not change because the subject did. They spent 4 days in the corridor that first trip. Stan took Bruce to 7 different locations across what Bruce had outlined on his density map. 4 of those locations produced tracks, with stride lengths and pad measurements consistent across all 4 sites. 2 locations produced fresh territorial markings on trees, the deep parallel gouges at heights between 5 and 7 feet that Bruce had read about in correspondent reports for years and could now examine in person. 1 location produced a kill site, an adult white-tailed doe, dragged into the cover of a cedar swamp and partially consumed, killed by something that had broken its neck and opened its throat with a single clean wound. The carcass had been worked on for at least a day based on the freezing of the exposed tissue. The tracks around the carcass matched the tracks in the wash, and the carcass had been placed at the base of a tree that bore the same territorial markings as the other marked trees. Bruce drove home Friday night with his casts in the bed of his truck, a folder of photographs on the passenger seat, and a tightness in his chest that had been growing for 4 days. He arrived after midnight. Nancy was asleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a glass of water and the folder of photographs in front of him, and he looked at the images for over an hour without moving. The data was real. He had spent 18 years tracking it from his home office, and he had told himself the whole time that he was building an academic project, a careful accumulation of evidence about a phenomenon studied at a comfortable distance. Now he had cast a track in northern Wisconsin that did not belong to any species in the field guide. The distance had collapsed. He went back the next month in March. The snow was still deep in the corridor and the access was harder, but he brought more equipment and he stayed for 10 days. Stan helped him set up trail cameras at 4 of the locations where they had found sign on the first trip. Bruce set up 2 infrared game cameras of his own at locations Stan suggested but had not visited recently. They worked the country systematically, walking transects through suitable habitat looking for additional sign. They found more tracks, more marked trees. They found a second kill site, this one a yearling whitetail buck with the same predation pattern as the doe. They found scat in 2 locations that Bruce sealed in evidence bags. And on the 8th night, sitting in Stan's pickup truck on a logging road in the Chequamegon at about 2 in the morning with the engine off and the windows down despite the cold, they heard it. The sound came from the timber to the south of the truck, somewhere in the cedar swamp that ran down to a small lake whose name nobody used. A low, oscillating vocalization, structured in repeating patterns with tonal variations that did not match any known species. The sound had the quality that Bruce had read about in correspondent reports for years and that he had heard described on phone calls but had never experienced directly. It was physical. The low-frequency component produced a sensation in his chest before he registered it consciously as sound. The duration of the vocalization was maybe 15 seconds. Then silence for a minute, then a response from somewhere else in the timber farther away at a slightly different tonal register. then silence again. Stan was sitting in the driver's seat with both hands on the steering wheel and his head slightly tilted, listening. He had heard this before. He had heard it more than once during his career, and he had heard it again 3 or 4 times since 2023. He was not surprised the way Bruce was. He was confirmed. The dogman in the corridor were communicating with each other, calling and answering across distance in a way that suggested coordinated movement or social organization or both. 2 animals communicating across maybe half a mile of cedar swamp at 2 in the morning is 2 animals that know about each other and are deciding something about how to relate to a third presence, which was the truck. Bruce understood that immediately. The moment when the second vocalization came back from the timber was the moment when his 18 years of database work stopped being a project and started being something else. He could not go back to treating this as an academic exercise. They sat in the truck until the vocalizations stopped completely, about 20 minutes after the first one. Then Stan started the engine and turned the truck around and drove back down the logging road toward the highway without saying a word. Bruce held the recorder he had been using in his lap. He had captured the entire exchange. He played it back when he got home and listened to it on his office speakers and felt the same sensation in his chest that he had felt sitting in the truck. By the end of that March trip, Bruce had cast 9 tracks from 5 separate locations, photographed 11 marked trees, documented 2 kill sites, collected 3 scat samples and 1 tuft of hair from a barbed wire fence near a property line, and recorded approximately 4 minutes of vocalizations from 2 separate nights. He had also, by his and Stan's combined count of distinct individuals based on track size variation and the temporal spacing of camera triggers, identified at least 7 different animals operating across the corridor. 7. In an area where his correspondent network had been reporting maybe 1 or 2 for as long as he had been tracking it. The population had concentrated there. Whatever was drawing them in was pulling them in from across most of the upper Great Lakes, and they were arriving with the kind of density he had never seen in any of the historical clusters from his database. He drove home from that second trip on a Sunday afternoon in heavy rain that turned to sleet south of Wausau. Nancy met him at the door and asked him what had been keeping him up north for so long, and he heard himself give her an answer about research travel that did not match the way he looked when he said it. He had been carrying the recording from the cedar swamp around in his head for the entire drive home. Nancy looked at him in the doorway and asked again what was going on. He told her he would tell her after dinner. He told her over dinner. The version he told her was the truthful version because Bruce had been married to Nancy for 43 years, and he had never been able to lie to her about anything that mattered. He told her about the database, the real scope of it. 18 years of work she had thought was a retirement hobby. He told her about what the data was showing, the population shift, the corridor, the convergence on a piece of country in northern Wisconsin. He told her about the field trips, the tracks, the kill sites, the recording from the cedar swamp at 2 in the morning. He played her the recording. She listened to it on his phone speaker across the kitchen table with her hands flat on the table on either side of her plate, and when it was finished she did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked him, in the tone she used when she was very carefully holding her temper, why he had not told her any of this for 18 years. The argument that followed was the worst they had ever had in their marriage. Nancy was not angry that the work was real. She was angry that Bruce had been carrying it alone, that he had not trusted her enough to share it, that she had been living in the same house with him for almost 2 decades without understanding what he had actually been doing in his office every night. She felt deceived. She told him so. She also told him, after they had both calmed down enough to talk again, that she thought he needed to either stop or commit to it completely, because the version where he kept it hidden from her and from everyone else was the version that was going to break him. Bruce did not know how to respond to that. He had not articulated to himself until Nancy said it, that he had been keeping the work secret because he had been afraid of what committing to it would mean. As long as he was just keeping a database in his spare time, he was still a federal cartographer with a respectable career and a quiet retirement. The moment he stood up and said publicly that he had been mapping Dogman sightings across 8 states for 18 years, and that the population was migrating into a specific corridor in Wisconsin, he became one of those people. The kind of person his former colleagues would discuss at retirement parties in the tone they had used when discussing the district ranger in Michigan, who had stopped doing field inspections alone. Nancy gave him a week to decide what he was going to do. Bruce spent that week in his office. He did not work on the database. He worked on the question of what he could do with what he had built. The options were limited. He could publish the database in some form as a research document attached to his real name and accept the professional consequences. He could publish it anonymously and hope nobody traced it back to him. He could approach a university zoology department or a wildlife research institution and present the data privately. He could approach the Wisconsin DNR or the Forest Service through official channels. He could approach the Bad River Band's Natural Resources Department through tribal channels. He could continue keeping it private and let the work die with him. The publication option had a hard, practical problem. The data, if released with the location information intact, would destroy what it documented. Bruce understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent his career thinking about how human attention affects wildlife populations. If he published a map showing that the entire Upper Great Lakes Dogman population was converging on a 600-square-mile corridor in northern Wisconsin, the corridor would be overrun within months. Trophy hunters from across the country, cryptid enthusiasts with night vision and rifles, documentary crews, YouTube personalities. The Bad River Reservation would face a wave of trespass and disturbance the Tribal Natural Resources Office was not staffed to handle. The Chequamegon National Forest would not have the law enforcement capacity to manage the influx. The corridor that the Dogman were apparently choosing as a refuge would cease to be a refuge approximately 20 minutes after the location went public. The institutional channel option had a different problem. Bruce had tried once in 2017 to share a portion of his findings with a former colleague who had moved into a research position at a state university. He had presented a small subset of the data and asked for an informal opinion on his methodology. The colleague's response had been a polite version of what Bruce had known it would be. The data was interesting. The methodology was sound. The subject was career-ending for anyone who pursued it. Bruce had thanked the colleague and changed the subject. The tribal channel was the one Bruce thought about most. The Bad River Band had legal and cultural standing no other institution in the corridor had. They controlled 4,000 acres of reservation land in the heart of the corridor. They had treaty rights in the broader ceded territory under the treaties of 1837 and 1842. They had a natural resources department that managed wildlife on tribal lands. The Bad River Band had fought a 10-year battle ending around 2015 against a proposed open-pit iron ore mine in the Penokee Hills that would have destroyed the headwaters of the river system that drained into their wild rice beds at the mouth of the Bad River. The tribe had won that fight. The mining company had withdrawn its proposal. The Penokee corridor remained intact. The country that the Dogman were converging on was country that the Bad River Band had spent over a decade defending from the most aggressive industrial development proposal in northern Wisconsin in 2 generations. They had won the fight specifically because they had refused to compromise on the protection of a place they considered sacred and ecologically irreplaceable. Bruce believed they would understand what he was bringing to them in a way that no federal or state agency would. He drove up in mid-April. He had called ahead. He had not used his real name. He had described himself as a retired wildlife professional doing independent research on regional predator distributions, who wanted to consult with the tribe's Natural Resources Office about findings he believed were relevant to their management responsibilities. The cultural specialist who took the call had asked him a few careful questions and then agreed to meet with him. The meeting was in a conference room at the Tribal Administration Building in O'Donnell, the small community on the reservation along the Bad River. Bruce brought a laptop with a redacted version of his database, his casts, and his photographs. He spent 2 hours laying out what he had found. The cultural specialist listened without interrupting. He was a man perhaps 10 years younger than Bruce, with the kind of professional composure that came from working at the interface between tribal traditions and the federal and state bureaucracies that surrounded the reservation. When Bruce finished, the specialist did not ask the questions Bruce had expected. He did not ask whether Bruce was sure about his identifications. He did not ask whether the methodology was sound. He asked one question. He asked Bruce why he had brought this information to the tribe. Bruce answered as honestly as he could. He said he believed the corridor was being chosen by the animals as a refuge because the surrounding regions had become inhospitable, and he believed the tribe was the only institution with both the cultural understanding and the legal standing to protect the corridor in a way that would not destroy what it was protecting. He said he did not know what to do with his data, and he did not want to publish it because publication would destroy the country it documented. He said he was looking for guidance. The specialist was quiet for a long time after Bruce finished. Then he told Bruce, in language Bruce remembered word for word, that the tribe was aware of what was moving into the corridor. He said the tribe had been aware of it for some time. The Natural Resources Department had been documenting unusual wildlife observations on the reservation for the past 3 years, and the patterns matched the patterns Bruce had described. He said the elders had a framework for understanding what was happening that did not require Western scientific terminology, and that the tribe was managing the situation through traditional protocols that the tribal government did not discuss publicly. He thanked Bruce for bringing the information. He said the tribe would not be acting on the data through any public channel. Bruce was welcome to continue his work, but the tribe would appreciate it if the specific location data remained between Bruce and the tribe. He gave Bruce a phone number Bruce could call if he found anything else he thought the tribe should know about. Bruce drove home from that meeting in a state of mind he had not been in since the early days of his career, when he was still learning how to be a federal employee in a region where federal authority was layered on top of older, deeper authorities that did not appear on his maps. The Anishinaabe relationship with this country predates the United States by centuries. The Anishinaabe relationship with the species the Anishinaabe call ma'ingan, which is the Ojibwe word for wolf, predates anything Bruce had studied in his graduate program in the late 1970s. The Anishinaabe oral tradition holds that the ma'ingan and the Anishinaabe were created together, that they walked the world together at the beginning, and that they share the same fate. What happens to the wolf happens to the Anishinaabe. What happens to the Anishinaabe happens to the wolf. The relationship is documented in scholarly literature and tribal publications in the public statements of tribal leaders during the wolf management disputes of the past 2 decades. It is one of the most consistent themes in Anishinaabe cultural expression. What the specialist had not said directly, but what Bruce understood from the tone of the conversation, was that the tribal framework for understanding what was moving into the corridor was related to the ma'ingan tradition but extended beyond it. There were beings the elders knew about that had been on the land before the Anishinaabe arrived in the upper Great Lakes around 1,500 years ago. Beings the Anishinaabe had encountered when they migrated west, following the prophecy of the 7 fires. Beings the Anishinaabe had developed a relationship with over the centuries that involved respect, distance and acknowledgement without specific naming. Those beings had their own territories, their own seasonal patterns, their own relationships with the land. They had been displaced in some places by the expansion of European settlement and the disruption of the forests, and they were now returning to places where the conditions were right for them to return. The corridor in northern Wisconsin was one of those places. The tribe was not surprised, the tribe was prepared. The connection between the Anishinaabe perspective and the data Bruce had been collecting clicked into place for him on the drive home. The Dogman population had not been moving randomly. It had been moving toward a refuge the Bad River Band had spent a decade defending specifically because the elders had told the tribal government, in the language of traditional ecological knowledge, that the corridor was sacred and irreplaceable. The mining proposal had been defeated through legal and political action that the public record attributed to environmental and treaty rights concerns. The actual reason, the deeper reason, was the kind of reason that does not appear in court filings because it operates on a different register than the legal system can process. The corridor had been protected because something in the corridor needed to be protected. The Anishinaabe had known what that something was. The legal system had not needed to know. The corridor was preserved either way. Bruce got home Friday night and sat with Nancy in their living room and told her everything that had happened in O'Donoghue. Nancy listened all the way through without interrupting. When he was finished, she asked him what he was going to do. Bruce told her he did not know. The path forward was no longer about what he could do with the data. The data had been received by the only institution that could meaningfully act on it. The path forward was about what he was going to do with the rest of his life, given that he now knew something most people did not know, and could not act on it through any of the channels his career had taught him to use. Nancy told him she would support whatever he decided. She also told him she thought he should consider letting go of some of it. She did not think a man in his late 60s should spend the rest of his life carrying the responsibility for a population of large predators he could not actually protect, and that did not need him to protect them because they had institutions of their own that had been protecting them for centuries. Bruce did not respond directly. He told her he would think about it. He thought about it for the next 8 months. During that time, he made 3 more trips to the corridor. He continued adding entries to the database. The reports kept coming. The pattern kept holding. By the fall of 2025, the corridor had received an estimated 38 credible reports through Bruce's network alone, and Stan's informal documentation was tracking another 17. The total identifiable individuals had reached, by Bruce's best estimate, somewhere between 9 and 14 distinct animals. The entire upper Great Lakes population, if his estimate was anywhere close to accurate, was now concentrated in a single corridor of less than 600 square miles. That kind of concentration is unsustainable for any wildlife population over the long term. Bruce knew this from his professional training. Apex predators require large territories. Even small populations of large carnivores need substantial habitat to maintain genetic diversity and prey availability. A population of 14 large predators in a 600 square mile area is at the upper end of what the habitat can sustain. If the migration continues, the corridor will exceed its capacity. The animals will either starve, disperse, or come into conflict with each other and with humans. None of those outcomes ends well. Bruce believes the migration is being driven by pressure. He spent the late summer and early fall of 2025 running an analysis on his historical data, looking at the regions where the populations had dropped off, trying to identify what had changed in those regions to push the animals out. The pattern was not subtle. The Wexford-Lake County corridor in Michigan had seen a substantial increase in industrial timber harvest activity beginning in 2021. The Manistee National Forest had been the site of 3 large wildfires in 2022 and 2023 that had altered substantial habitat. The Boundary Waters area in Minnesota had experienced unprecedented levels of recreational use during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. The Pennsylvania and Ohio populations had been affected by natural gas development, with hydraulic fracturing operations and associated road and pipeline construction fragmenting habitat across the Appalachian Plateau. Every region that had lost its population had lost it because human pressure had increased, and the one region that was gaining population was the region that the Bad River Band had spent 10 years defending from exactly that kind of pressure. The math is not complicated. The Dogman are not migrating randomly. They are migrating in response to the same environmental degradation that affects every other large predator in North America. The same factors that have driven wolves and cougars and grizzly bears into smaller and more isolated populations are now driving the Dogman into a single corridor of land that retains the qualities they need to survive. The corridor exists because of the Bad River Band's defense of it. The defense exists because of the Anishinaabe relationship with the land that predates the United States by centuries, and that does not require the United States to recognize it in order to be effective. Bruce called me the morning after he came back from his 4th trip to the corridor in November of 2025. He had been corresponding with us for several months by that point after reaching out following one of our earlier Dogman videos. He had been thinking about whether to bring his story to the channel for over a year, weighing the risk of even partial disclosure against the value of getting the larger pattern in front of an audience that might care about it. The decision had been made for him by something that happened on that 4th trip. He and Stan had been at one of the observation sites they had been using since the previous year, a ridgeline overlook above a section of cedar swamp where they had captured vocalizations and tracks on multiple occasions. They had been there since before sunset, sitting in Stan's truck with the windows cracked, recording equipment running, thermal optics on the dashboard. Around 2:30 in the morning, the thermal scope picked up movement in the swamp below them. 5 distinct heat signatures in a loose formation moving northwest along the swamp edge. What struck Bruce as he tracked them across the field of view was the spacing. The animals were maintaining distance from each other. They were not following each other in single file the way wolves would, and they were not bunched together the way a coyote pack might cluster. They were spread out, maybe 30 yards apart, moving in a loose line across the landscape with a coordination that did not require any animal to be the leader. They were maintaining formation by some means that did not involve continuous visual contact, because the cedar swamp was thick enough that the animals could not have been seeing each other constantly. They were either communicating by some other means or they had moved together so often that the formation was internalized. Bruce had time to count them 3 times to be sure. 5 animals, in a single group, moving northwest, which would have taken them deeper into the Chequamegon and eventually into the Bayfield Peninsula country along Lake Superior. He watched them on the thermal scope until the last animal passed out of view at the far edge of the field, maybe 4 minutes after the first one entered it. Then he sat in the truck with Stan in silence for a long time, because what he had just observed was not a coincidental gathering. It was a moving group of 5 individuals traveling together with purpose, in a direction that suggested they were going somewhere specific. The migration he had been documenting from his database was not just bringing animals into the corridor. It was reorganizing them once they got there. The animals that had moved in from Michigan and Minnesota were aggregating into groups, and the groups were moving together, and the corridor was becoming something other than a refuge. It was becoming a staging area. Bruce did not know and still does not know what they are staging for. He has theories. None of them are comfortable. The most benign possibility is that the animals are aggregating because population pressure is forcing them into closer contact with each other, and the species is more social than the historical data suggested. The less benign possibility is that the animals are aggregating as a response to something specific, and that the response is preparing them for action that would not have been possible for isolated individuals or small territorial pairs. What the action might be is the part Bruce will not speculate about on the record. He has been thinking about it for months, and he does not have an answer he is willing to commit to. He just knows that 5 animals moving together at 2 in the morning through cedar swamp in northern Wisconsin in November is not the behavior of a species settling into a new territory. It is the behavior of a species preparing for something. The conversation with the cultural specialist at the Bad River Administration building keeps coming back to him. The specialist had said the tribe was prepared. Bruce had taken that to mean the tribe was prepared to manage the wildlife situation through traditional protocols. He has begun to wonder in the months since whether the specialist meant something else, whether the tribe was prepared in the way that any community prepares when it knows that something is coming that the broader society is not aware of. The Anishinaabe oral tradition includes prophecies about the 8th fire, the period in human history when the choices made by the dominant society will determine whether humanity continues on its current path or finds a different way. Bruce is not an Anishinaabe person, and he is not in any position to interpret Anishinaabe prophecy. He just notes that the conversation in Odana fit a worldview that is not the same as the wildlife management worldview he was trained in. Within that framework, the migration may not be the disruption he initially read it as. It may be the expected pattern. Stan retired from his informal documentation work at the end of 2025. He told Bruce he was tired. He was 68 years old and his knees were bad, and he had been chasing this thing through his old district for almost 3 years, and he needed to step back. He gave Bruce his notebook and his evidence collection. He told Bruce he would still take phone calls, but he was not driving out into the country at night anymore. Bruce did not blame him. The work had taken something out of him. Bruce noticed it during their last in-person meeting, a long lunch at a roadhouse outside Mercer in early December. Stan had lost weight. He was drinking more than he used to. He was checking the window of the restaurant when cars pulled into the parking lot in a way Bruce had seen before in former colleagues who had carried difficult work past the point where it was good for them. Stan was done. Bruce understood. They shook hands in the parking lot and Bruce drove home knowing that he was now on his own. The personal cost of the past 3 years has been substantial. Bruce's relationship with Nancy survived the argument in March of 2025, but it changed. They are still married. They still live in the same house. Nancy is still supportive of Bruce in the broad sense. But the work has become something that sits between them. Nancy does not ask about the database anymore. Bruce does not bring it up. When he goes north for a trip, she tells him to be careful and to call her when he gets to Stan's place. He tells her he will. They eat dinner together. They watch the same television shows they have watched for years. The work continues in the background, invisible to anyone who walks into their house, and they have developed a kind of separate peace around it. The peace is real, but it is not the same as what they had before he showed her the recording from the cedar swamp. Something is gone. Bruce knows what it is. He cannot get it back. His daughter lives in Madison. She is in her late 30s, married with 2 kids in elementary school. She does not know about the database. She does not know about the trips to northern Wisconsin. Bruce has decided not to tell her because he does not want her to worry, and because he is not certain how she would respond. She would either accept what he was saying, in which case she would worry about him constantly, or she would not accept it, in which case she would start having conversations with Nancy about whether Bruce was experiencing cognitive decline. Bruce has chosen to avoid that by simply not bringing the work into the family. He visits Madison every few months. He plays with his grandkids. He talks about the weather and the Packers. He does not mention what is in the file cabinet in his home office. The institutional silence around what Bruce has documented is the part of the story he most wants people to understand. The reason you have never heard about a Dogman migration in the upper Great Lakes is not because the migration is hidden. The data exists. Bruce's database exists. Stan's notebook exists. The track casts exist. The recordings exist. The Bad River Band's Natural Resources Department is aware. The reason you have never heard about it is structural. There is no agency in the United States that has the legal authority and the institutional capacity to recognize, classify, and manage a species the federal government does not acknowledge exists. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service operates under the Endangered Species Act, which protects species after they have been recognized. The state DNR agencies in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and the other affected states operate under wildlife management codes that include taxonomies of recognized species. The Forest Service manages habitat for species the Forest Service has been told to manage habitat for. None of those institutions has a mechanism for processing reports of an unrecognized species. The reports either get filed under the closest available category, which is usually large canid of unknown origin or possible hybrid, or they get filed under the heading of public submissions that do not require further action. The pattern Bruce has identified, the migration he has tracked, the corridor he has outlined, exists in his home office and in Stan's notebook and in the awareness of the Bad River Band, and in nowhere else because no other entity has the capacity to hold it. That structural silence has consequences beyond Bruce's professional dilemma. It means the migration is occurring in an environment where the receiving habitat is not protected by any federal or state classification that would account for the species' presence. The Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest is managed under multiple-use principles that allow for timber harvest, recreation, and various commercial activities. Future timber sales in the corridor would proceed through the normal Forest Service planning process, which would include environmental impact assessments for the recognized species but would not factor in the population that does not officially exist. New road construction, new recreational developments, new energy infrastructure proposals would all move forward without any consideration of the population that has converged there. The Bad River Band can defend the tribal portion of the corridor through its sovereign authority. The tribe cannot extend that defense across the entire 600 square miles. The animals that have aggregated into the corridor are protected by no legal framework, recognized by no institution, and accounted for in no planning process. They survive because the corridor remains intact. The corridor remains intact because the tribe has continued to defend it for reasons that overlap with but are not identical to the protection of the population. What Bruce wants people to understand at the end of 18 years of work is something he stated to me directly during our last conversation. He said the Dogman are not the story. He said the Dogman have been doing what they do for as long as anyone has been on this continent, and they will continue doing it after every institution that currently exists in North America has been replaced by something else. The story is what the migration tells us about the country we have built. The animals are leaving regions where human activity has reached saturation. They are converging on a region that has been defended against human activity by a tribal nation whose traditional ecological knowledge has been more accurate over a longer time period than any of the management agencies operating under federal or state authority. The corridor exists because a small group of people who have lived on this land for centuries fought hard enough and long enough to protect it. The other regions did not have anyone to fight that fight for them, and those regions are losing their populations as a result. The animals are doing what animals do. The landscape is doing what landscapes do under pressure. The corridor is doing what protected refugia do when surrounding habitat degrades. The story is the story. That nobody in a position of authority can hold it is a problem of institutional capacity, not a problem with the story. The corridor is still there as I am putting this story together. The Dogman are still there. The reports are still coming in. Bruce is still making trips. He went up in early March of 2026 to check on the trail cameras he and Stan had set up the previous year, several of which Stan had not been able to check after he stepped back from the work. Bruce drove the loop himself. He pulled SD cards from 3 of the cameras. 2 of them held footage that confirmed what he had been documenting for over a year. The third held something he was not expecting. The third camera had captured on a clear, cold night in late February a group of 7 animals moving through the field of view in a tight formation across an open meadow in the Chequamegon. 7. The largest group he had ever documented through any of his data collection. The animals had moved together across the meadow and into the timber on the far side, covering the open ground in approximately 40 seconds. They had not looked at the camera. They had not deviated from their line of travel. They had moved with the kind of coordinated purpose he had observed on the thermal scope the previous November, but with 2 additional animals in the group. He brought the footage home. He showed it to Nancy on the screen of his laptop at the kitchen table. Nancy watched it twice. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked him what he thought it meant. Bruce told her he did not know. She nodded and got up and started making dinner. The conversation ended there. They have not talked about the footage since. Bruce sometimes drives up to a stretch of Highway 2 between Hurley and Ashland and pulls over at one of the wayside parks on the south side of the road. From the parking area, the country opens up to the south in a long view of forested ridges and river valleys that run back toward the Penokees. You cannot see anything from the wayside that would suggest the country is different from any other stretch of upper Wisconsin forest. The trees look the same. The hills look the same. The Lake Superior wind comes down the same way it has been coming down since the glaciers left. There is nothing on the landscape that would tell you that an entire regional population of a species the federal government does not acknowledge has converged on the 600 square miles spread out in front of you. Bruce stands in the parking lot sometimes for half an hour, looking out at that country. He told me he is not looking for anything in particular. The animals are in there. They are alive in a place that has been protected for them by people who have been doing the protecting for reasons that go back further than anything he can map. He still adds to the database. Reports still come in through his correspondent network. The pattern still holds. He has not published. He has not given the location data to anyone outside the Bad River Cultural Office and Stan and this channel. He has begun to think that the database, after 18 years of work, may be most valuable as something that does not get released. As a private record. As a witness in the original sense of the word, Bruce told me he can live with that. The alternative is to release information that would destroy what the information is about, and he is not willing to do that. If you have spent time in the country between Hurley and Ashland or anywhere in the Chequamegon or along the Bad River, you may have heard something at night that you could not place. A vocalization in the cedar swamp at 2 in the morning. A track in the spring snow that did not match anything in your field guide. A pair of yellow eyes at the edge of your headlights on a logging road that was too high off the ground to belong to a coyote. If you have, you are not alone. And you are not mistaken. Something is in that country. Something has been moving toward it for years and is now settling into it in numbers that have not been seen before in the historical record. The institution that is tracking it is a retired federal cartographer with a database in his home office and a stack of trail camera footage in his closet. He has been doing the work alone for 18 years because there was no other institution that would do it. The work continues. The animals continue. The corridor holds. Bruce is in his home office tonight as I am finishing this. Nancy is asleep. The map is on his wall. The pins are in their places. The pattern is what the pattern is. He has not slept well in 3 years. He is 68 years old. The animals he has been mapping have been in this country for longer than any record can measure. They will be in this country after he is gone. The corridor will be in this country after he is gone. And whatever they are preparing for, the preparation will continue whether or not he is here to document it. That is the thought that he comes back to at the end of every conversation about this. The continuation. That the story does not end with him. The corridor holds. The animals come. The pattern continues. And on the ridgeline above the Bad River, in the cedar swamps along the Marengo, in the deep timber where the road network thins out and the country opens up into something older than the maps can show. They are still moving in the dark, in formations that nobody has ever seen before, towards something that nobody outside that country has the standing to name.